So today's talk is really going to be about this idea of, we've been exploring this idea of more, about our journey into our personal calling. And today I'm going to talk about this dynamic between primary calling that we have, as well as secondary calling. And really how the foundation of both primary calling and secondary calling is love. That being rooted and established in love is really the base foundation for being able to live this out. Now, of course, primary calling is this idea that there's a calling that God has for every single believer. Anyone who says that they're a follower of Jesus, the call is to be a disciple who makes disciples, who goes into every nook and cranny of society. That's the primary call for every single Christian. But secondary calling is a unique calling. It's a personal calling for each one of us. That means that each one of us in our different callings and our different vocations are called in a secondary way, in a specific kind of way. And we're actually going to explore this dynamic of primary calling and secondary calling in the life of Paul. And Paul actually writes to the church in Ephesus, and in his letter to the Ephesians, he actually describes his own primary calling as well as secondary calling and how the two relate to each other. And so in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 to 3, this is what it says. It says, "For this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus, for the sake of you Gentiles, surely you have heard about the administration of God's grace that was given to me for you." So in the beginning of chapter 3 in Ephesians then, he gives this kind of description of who he is. And here he actually describes this dynamic of secondary calling, his unique calling. And really the acronym that I'm about to present to you that's been developed by some others, a very helpful acronym called GPS. Kind of like a navigation system for all of us in our vehicles and whatever else it might be. GPS is basically another tool for us to discover what is our secondary or our personal or our unique calling. And in this passage here in Ephesians chapter 3, we see Paul's GPS. Now, what does GPS stand for? It stands for gifts, it stands for passion, and it stands for story. Now, I'll kind of go in reverse story, though, in explaining this in Ephesians chapter 3. So first, Paul begins by sharing his story. So in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 1, this is what he says. He says, "For this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus." Now, if you know anything about the life and the journey of Paul, you know that he was constantly imprisoned. He was shipwrecked. He had 40 lashes. He encountered all sorts of immense kinds of suffering. And that's why in verse 13 it also says this. It says, "I ask you, therefore, not to be discouraged because of my sufferings for you, which are for your glory," or which are your glory. Now, isn't that interesting then? Here Paul is, and he's talking about his personal story. Because the uniqueness of Paul's story was that he would be someone that would encounter all sorts of suffering. In fact, when he's writing this letter to the Ephesians, history tells us that he's writing it from prison in AD 62. So can you imagine? So he's writing this letter to the church in Ephesus, and he's basically talking to them about how he himself is a prisoner for Christ and someone who has taken on all sorts of immense kinds of suffering. Now, like I mentioned, in Paul's life, we see that kind of suffering all the time. Now, that unique story of how Paul is able to wade through suffering is something that's very distinct for his life. And in fact, what's interesting is there's all sorts of passages, again, where we discover that Paul underwent suffering, imprisonment, and in the book of Philippians, it actually also talks about how Paul says that he's chained to an elite military Roman guard, and in his chains, he's chained for the gospel, but through him being chained to, if you can imagine him literally being chained to an elite military man, because of alleged crimes that he had committed for his faith and being so outspoken in his faith, he's chained for this in his own story. But you know what he says in the book of Philippians? He says that the whole palace guard, because of his chains, they know the story of Jesus Christ. Now, isn't that amazing? So here Paul is, from his own story then, what so shaped his story was that no matter what suffering would come, no matter what difficulties would come, no matter what chains he would carry, he would constantly be sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, that unique story that shapes and marks Paul's life is something that really has led him to be the kind of person that can talk about in your suffering, when you go through these episodes where you feel chained. In other words, he can be someone who can speak with such an authority because of his own story of suffering and difficulty. He can begin to teach about the ways in which the chains that he carries can actually be used for God's glory. And that's a unique part of his story. His story is one that can say, hey, I know that things might seem absolutely bleak in your life, where you might feel like you are carrying the weightiest kinds of chains, where you might feel like, man, you are undergoing immense amounts of suffering, whether it's an illness, whether it's a difficulty in your job situation, whether it's an addiction, whether it's broken relationships. Like, no matter what chains you carry, and this is why Paul, from his disposition, when he talks about his story, it's constantly about being able to see the grace of God in the midst of even some of our most trying circumstances. Now, this is a unique part of Paul's story, and this is why he identifies himself as a prisoner for Christ. So not only story, though, but also passion. If you read in Ephesians chapter 3, when it comes to passions, he says, "For this reason I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus," there's his story. He says, "for the sake of you Gentiles," in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 1. And here he demonstrates his passions. His passion was that he felt called to serve and to love and to reach the Gentiles. Now, isn't this amazing? And isn't this so ironic that for someone like Paul, who was once a Pharisee, who was as devout in his Pharisaism as a Jewish follower of Yahweh, that somehow Paul would have this radical encounter of the living Jesus. And after that radical encounter, he would change his passions now to be someone who would fervently be talking about the good news of Jesus and the breadth of it that would welcome in Gentiles. I mean, it's so amazing that of all the people that God would choose to have their passions be changed would be the Apostle Paul. That he is now someone where another letter demonstrates to us that Peter was recognized as the apostle to the Jews, but Paul here was recognized as an apostle to the Gentiles. That somehow God had redirected him so that his passions were directed now towards loving and serving and reaching Gentiles, non-Jews, and telling them of the broad, beautiful, expansive love of Jesus that welcomes Gentiles into the family of God. Passions are kind of like a directional arrow in our heart. The things that stir us, that give us passion, that gets us up and energized. And for Paul, his passion was the Gentiles. But not only, again, story and passions, but also gifting. So if you look, when it comes to gifting, it says, "For this reason I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus, for the sake of you Gentiles," again, there's his story and then his passions. It says in verse 2, "Surely you have heard about the administration of God's grace that was given to me for you. The mystery has been made known to me by revelation, which was not made known to people in other generations, as it has now been revealed by the Spirit to God's holy apostles and prophets," in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. Now, so there's his story, there's his passion for the Gentiles, but there's also a gifting that God has bestowed on his life. The gifting was that it was revealed to him, the mystery of the gospel was revealed to him, and now he was sent out as an apostle, as one of these holy apostles. And here he describes that this was a gift that God gave to him. So part of his secondary call then, his unique kind of masterpiece story, the secondary call that God has for Paul is shaped by his GPS, his giftings as an apostle, his passion for the Gentiles, and his story, where in the midst of whatever suffering that he would befall, that he'd be able to cling to the good news that Jesus was going to work through him, that the Spirit was going to work through him, and that Jesus would be known in the midst of his sufferings. GPS, his secondary calling, was shaped and very much by his giftings, his passions, as well as his story. Now, of course, though, when it comes to this dynamic of secondary calling and primary calling, as we've talked about, this idea of primary calling, these things work together. And secondary calling, which is unique story, GPS, is secondary to primary calling that all of us have. And that's why Paul says in Ephesians chapter 3, later on in the passage, he says, in the midst of his GPS, he still has this primary calling. Check out verse 7. It says, I became a servant of this gospel by the gift of God's grace given me through the working of his power. In other words, this is what he's saying. He's saying, my GPS has shaped my secondary calling. But at the end of the day, all of this goes under my primary calling. My primary calling to do what? To be a servant of the gospel. To be a disciple who makes disciples in every nook and cranny of society. And here, this is what he's saying. He's basically saying, every disciple of Jesus has one message, the gospel, and one method, make disciples. And so in verse 7, this is what he's saying, that this is the way that primary calling and secondary calling work together. Yes, I have a secondary calling, but my primary calling at the end of the day is to be a servant of the gospel. Now, this whole dynamic between primary and secondary calling, though, what is the fuel that allows someone to flourish in their primary and secondary calling? How in the world are we supposed to live this out? This idea of calling, of primary calling and or secondary calling? Well, Paul writes to us that the very foundation of our lives for God is found in this prayer that he prays at the end of chapter 3, or in chapter 3, verses 14 to 19. This is what it says. It says, for this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you being rooted and grounded in love. Can I hear you say rooted and grounded in love?
Rooted and grounded in love.
That you being rooted and grounded in love may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. What a beautiful prayer. It's a prayer that basically says, man, my prayer is that for all of us, that the very foundation of our lives is that we would be rooted and established in love, rooted and grounded in God's love. That the very fuel for us to live out any kind of calling in this world is love. And for us as Christians is to embrace and to be filled with the all-encompassing, incredible, magnanimous love of God. Now, here's the thing. What happens when we're not living full of love? What happens to our sense of calling? What happens to our sense of future if we're not rooted and established in love? Tim Keller, when he talks about kind of work and going about one's vocation, he said, one of the most difficult things is for when it comes to work is when success can get to your head, but failure can get to your heart. And how can we live in such a manner in which success doesn't get to our heads and failure doesn't get to our hearts? Now, what does he mean by that? He means that isn't it so easy that when success happens in our vocations and in our callings, it's so easy for us to be puffed up with pride about it and to think so highly of ourselves, to think that we're kind of the bomb. And when failure comes, there's a way that failure can impact our hearts. When it comes to our callings, when it comes to failure, when it comes to shame, when it comes to all sorts of ways in which we might feel like we failed, how that can devastate our hearts. Now, how in the world do we live in such a manner where success doesn't get to our head and failure doesn't get to our hearts? How? It's by being rooted and established in love. Here's what I know, that whenever I feel unloved, the worst parts of me often come out. I think my insecurities come out. I know that fear comes out. I get super anxious when I feel unloved. I know that sometimes anger comes out and I've got like a chip on my shoulder, like I have something to prove. I think I lack courage. I can compare myself to other people whenever I'm not rooted and established in love. All of these different symptoms of what it's like to not be loved. And one of the books that I've been deeply shaped by is this little book called From Brokenness to Community by Vanier. And Vanier worked in this community that was founded called L'Arche Community. And it was a community that invited people with physical and mental handicaps to the community to live and to hopefully flourish as a community. And here's what he writes about this idea of being unloved. And he writes about the very people in this community that he's worked with. He says, for 25 years now, I've had the privilege of living with men and women with disabilities. I have discovered that even though a person may have severe brain damage, that is not the source of his or her greatest pain. The greatest pain is rejection. The feeling that nobody really wants you like that. The feeling that you are seen as ugly, dirty, a burden, of no value. That is the pain I have discovered in the hearts of our people. We all know that a child, even on the day of his or her birth, knows whether he or she is loved. And if the child feels loved, the body is relaxed, the eyes are bright, there is a smile on the face. In some way, the flesh becomes transparent. A child that is loved is beautiful. But what happens when children feel they are not loved? There's tension, there's fear, loneliness, and terrible anguish, which we call inner pain, the opposite of inner peace. Children are too small and weak to be able to fend for themselves. They have no defense mechanisms. If a child feels unloved and unwanted, he or she will develop a broken self-image. I have never heard any of our men or women in this community full of disabled men and women. He says, I have never heard any men or women whom we have welcomed into our community criticize their parents, even though many of them have suffered a great deal from rejection or abandonment in their families. Rather than blaming their parents, they blame themselves. If I am not loved, it is because I am not lovable. Of course, it's not only people with mental disabilities who are wounded and suffering from broken self-image. Many people in our world today are living deep inner pain and anguish. I mean, isn't that true? That when someone feels rejected or feels unloved, it completely changes the game. Abled or disabled, we all know when someone feels secure and loved and cherished. I know that for myself, there are parts of my own family history where I struggle with my own sense of self-image and self-worth. And I know that it's so difficult for me to accept myself as a loved human being. And so I struggle with all sorts of insecurities. And so when it comes out to living out any kind of calling, primary calling or secondary calling, I know that if I'm not rooted and established in love, the worst parts of me come out. But here's what I do know. I know that when I can believe the gospel, believe the good news, that my self-worth is not based on my performance, is not based on how well I perform or how great a pastor I am, but when I realize that my self-worth is simply based in the good news of Jesus, that I'm deeply loved as his son. I'm deeply loved because of what Jesus has done for me, the life that he lived, the death that he died, and the fact that he resurrected. When I can embrace that his love is for me, it changes the game in terms of the way I live now. Because now I don't have to succumb to some of the insecurities that so easily haunt me. I don't have to succumb to some of the shame that so easily haunts me. And so what does this mean then to be rooted and established in love? Well, number one, I have nothing to fear. I can live with courage. Can I hear you say nothing to fear?
Nothing to fear.
That's right. I can live a courageous kind of life. Because when I'm rooted and established in love, I'm not fearful about even my shame. one of the things that matters so deeply to me is like how other people perceive me. And so I care so deeply about how other people perceive me. And so with that, I can carry all sorts of shame, especially like different parts of me that I don't want other people to know. Because if they found out, God forbid they found out some things about me, then I would be so lost in shame. And I'd think, man, I don't even deserve to be a pastor. There's some moments when, say, for instance, like I'm about to preach on a Sunday, I'll start thinking about something that I said. And I know this sounds crazy, but sometimes when I'm getting ready to preach, I'll be thinking about like, oh my goodness, when I was 16 years old, I said that mean thing to that one girl in that one class. Drew, you're such an idiot. Like, I'll start thinking about this like when I was 16, like this right before I'm about to get to preach, And I'll start thinking about these things and I'm like, I'm such a sinner. And who in the world am I to be a pastor in this community? Who am I in the world to like be preaching? Like there are so many ways, like the shame just saddles me. And it's in those moments that I need to preach the gospel to myself, that you are deeply loved, that you're rooted and established in love, that you can live with nothing to fear in terms of trying to impress, but you can live with courage. Can you imagine the Apostle Paul? Like Paul, can you imagine for him? He's got this calling, he's got this secondary calling, he's got this primary calling. And here the Apostle Paul was, though. In his former life, he was someone that persecuted Christians. He was someone that would oversee the stoning and the deaths of Christians. I mean, can you imagine for Paul? Like, can you imagine if he somehow would succumb to his shame? Because somehow he convinced himself that, man, I'm beyond God's grace, that there's no way that God could love me because of all the things that I've done. But yet, Paul, here he is, and he writes this beautiful prayer about what it's like to live, and to live fully and freely. And this is his prayer for all of us, that if we could just be rooted and established in love, it would change everything. We'd live with nothing to fear. We'd live with courage to walk into it, even amidst the things that might feel shameful for us. We'd also have nothing to hide. In other words, we could live with brokenness and humility. If we truly believe that we're fully loved, fully accepted, that we're rooted and established in love, then that would lead me to be humble. That would lead me to be okay with the fact that I do make mistakes. That would lead me to believe that, you know what, it's okay to even share my mistakes, because guess what? God's grace and his love can shine even brighter. When I try to live out my personal calling or my secondary calling, there are so many ways in which I might try to kind of put up a front in terms of who I am, try to put up a mask of perfection, like I'm this accomplished person, I've got it all together. But do you see, if I truly believe that I'm rooted and established in love, then I'd have nothing to hide. I could actually live with brokenness and humility, but I could also live with courage. And I could live in such a freedom from any kind of insecurity or pride that might befall me. And lastly, what I like to talk about is I'd have nothing to prove. I'd be free from comparison. I wouldn't have a chip on my shoulder. I wouldn't be operating out of, man, I'm going to show you what I can do. I wouldn't be operating out of like, man, I just want to be like better than that pastor in the city or whatever else it might be. But if I'm truly, deeply rooted and established in love, then I can begin to live with nothing to prove. I don't have to compare myself to other people. When I come to gatherings like the past couple days, I know this is my industry as a pastor, and for some of you all in your industries, this might be different, but it's so easy for me to play the comparison game. Like, to hear someone who's an extraordinary preacher and to somehow be like, oh man, I wish I could speak like that. I wish I was as smart as Tim Keller. I wish I was as popular as this pastor. I wish this church, the church that I lead, was way bigger than that person's church, because I don't really like that person very much, right? I feel a little embarrassed saying that, but nonetheless, like the comparison trap, like so many times I can fall into that. as if I have something to prove to other people. And because I feel so insecure about who I am, that instead of wishing well, I mean, isn't this crazy? Instead of wishing well on other pastors and churches, I can be jealous of them and want my church and quote unquote my ministry to be better than that person's. I mean, can you imagine what God might think about that? And yet that's the kind of stuff that creeps in whenever I don't feel rooted and established in love. Whenever I start feeling like, oh man, that the church that person is leading is way cooler than mine. And I think that's a temptation whenever I'm in a room full of other pastors, is to want to try to prove myself, to prove that I belong, to prove that I'm better than other people. When all along, all it shows is that I'm not rooted and established in love. That I'm not living out of a freedom and a fullness. Now, can you imagine, though, like what it would be like for all of us if we lived free from all of that stuff, free from fear, free from shame, free from chip on the shoulder, free from trying to prove ourselves, free from like trying to hide and be self-protected? Like, can you imagine how freeing that would be? Can you imagine how freeing it would be to know, to be rooted and established in God's love so deeply? That it would free us from the ways in which we make comparisons of ourselves and other people. And if you're a parent, the way that you might compare your kid to the other person's kid. It's kind of crazy how that happens even. Can you imagine, though, how that would change so many of our lives? How we could live with such freedom if we were just deeply, deeply soaked in this reality that we're rooted and established in love. How it would allow us to live into our callings, our primary calling and our secondary calling, with such freedom, a levity, and a power and authority, because we know that we're loved by a good dad. Isn't that amazing? How that would change us, how that would make us even courageous to go for it. Not to talk ourselves out of things because, oh my goodness, I'm not that great a Christian and there's no way that God could be calling me to, but that we would live with such a fire in our bones, a kind of courage that would dare to change the world. That we would be shaped, that the very fuel that would give us kind of the fuel to go for it would be the love of God. That we were so full of this love of God that we didn't give into our insecurities. We didn't give into our comparisons. We didn't give into our shame. But we lived with such courage and freedom and power. Can you imagine how that would change us? Can you imagine how that would change our church? Can you imagine how that would change our city if we lived with that kind of freedom and power and courage?